Is there anything you'd like us to add to research about you?
Well, I don't know. I mean, I could tell you a little bit more about my family.
Yeah, that's good.
I don't know exactly what you'd like to hear about. Do you want to hear about, when I go into classrooms, I usually talk about the rest of my family that didn't survive and what happened to them. I don't know if that's what you want, or you want to hear more about my life, you know, as a refugee in the United States, or?
Yeah, well, we don't have a specific subject about it, so you can choose what you would like.
Oh, okay. Well, just kind of, well, why don't I start by telling you about the rest of my family then. I gave you the story about my Uncle Max, who ended up going to France. He went to Belgium. He was a jazz musician, and he played an accordion and the piano, and he used to play in clubs in Vienna. And when the Nazis marched into Austria, you know, he eventually, they were picking up all the, especially the young Jewish men, and he was in his 20s, so he left the country and went to Brussels, and then he was kicked out of there and went to France, and thought he would be safe there, but then the Nazis marched into France, and they, as I said, the Vichy government picked him up and put him in their concentration camps. He was in a couple of camps, and the main one was called Gurs, G-U-R-S, and it was, I think on a scale of 1 to 10, it probably wasn't as bad as the Nazi camps, but it still was pretty bad. The man in charge of the camp was given money for food, but any money he didn't buy food with, he got to keep. So you can imagine how much food the people there got. But he was free to play his accordion and go out and play in clubs. He probably had to give part of the money to the camp director, but at any rate, he had a little bit of a little better life there. And but then they took everybody from there eventually. And what the French did is when the Nazis marched in, they made an agreement that they would not pick up the French Jews. They would only pick up the ones that had been born in a different country. And of course, Max was born in Vienna, so he didn't count. So he was one of the first people picked up. There's a book and a movie called Sarah's Keys, and it tells about, if you ever get a chance to see that film, it's a really good film, or read the book. It tells about a family in France that was picked up by the Vichy government, and it's, you know, the same kind of story as Max. I mean, of being picked up and taken to the camps. So he eventually was put in. He was taken from that camp to Auschwitz and Buchenwald, and he was on one of those last marches, and he survived the whole entire war until the very end, and died just weeks before liberation, maybe days before liberation. But right before liberation, he was on one of those last marches and starved to death. My grandparents went to Czechoslovakia. My one group of grandparents went to Czechoslovakia, and they ended up being picked up and taken to Theresienstadt and different camps there. Everybody ended up in a different concentration camp. Since my grandparents were old, they probably didn't survive. The minute they got into the camps, they were probably taken to the showers. My dad's sister married a Yugoslavian man, and they went to Yugoslavia, and they were picked up and put in the camp Jasenovac. And there my dad's brother-in-law died very early. He was picked up first and died very early. And his sister and her daughter had to work out in the fields, and they died in 1942-43. my cousin, Walter, was younger. He was 1920 at the time at the end of the war. And he was an electrician, so he probably got to work inside and maybe even got a little extra food. And because of that, he survived. At the end of the war, they were going to liquidate the camps. And whenever you hear the word liquidate, it means they were going to kill all the people in the camps. Because both the Nazis and this happened to be the Croatians, but they didn't want anybody left to tell about the horrible conditions. And so they were going to liquidate the camps. So about 200 prisoners stormed the guards. Now the guards had machine guns. The prisoners had no weapons at all. But out of those 200 and some, 80 escaped, and Walter was one of the 80. And he was picked up by the communists then and healed back to health. They gave him food and things. And eventually he found an aunt in Yugoslavia and lived with her. We tried to get him into the United States, but because of all the immigration laws, we never could. And so he immigrated to Israel. And in 1983, my mother and I, my dad had died in 81. My mother and I went to Israel, and I got to meet Walter. And he married and had children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren and ended up being an electrician in Israel. And then another part of my family went to Shanghai. Shanghai was one of the safe havens where you could go without an affidavit. And so they ended up in Shanghai during the war. And Shanghai and the Dominican Republic were two of the places that took people in without any papers. So there were a few places in the world that let Jews in. And kind of interesting because Trujillo, who was the head of the Dominican Republic, Haiti and the Dominican Republic, he was really a horrible man and killed a lot of the Haitians. On the other hand, he wanted the Jews in his country to work and to intermarry with the blacks in the community. And so he let them in. Now, of course, what happened, instead of the farm, he was hoping for farmers because it was farmland. What he got was Jews from the big cities like Berlin and Vienna that never had worked on a farm before, and most of that was dairy land. So they opened dairies there and lived there during the war. But it was a safe haven, and they were free from being, One of our speakers, Miriam Gerber, went to Dominican Republic and lived there during the war. After the war, many of them went to the United States or to England or to other places. So there isn't a big community there anymore, but during the war it was a huge Jewish community. So that's the story of the rest of my family. I guess I can tell you a little bit about me. One of the things, I showed you my passport, and because we had an Austrian, German passport that was put out by the Nazi government, remember it had all the Nazi insignias on it. When we came through Japan, we caught a ship in Kobe and came to the United States. Our very first stop actually was Canada, was Vancouver, British Columbia. But because we had German passports and England was at war with Germany, and Canada was part of the British Commonwealth, we couldn't get off the ship in Canada, even though we'd been on the ship through a typhoon, and everybody was seasick, except my dad. He had a wonderful time. But everybody else, all of us were seasick on the trip over, went through some really bad weather. And we were looking forward to getting off the ship and being able to walk around, and we couldn't because we had German passports, even though we were escaping the Nazis. So then we ended up in Seattle, and they had a quota on immigrants, on Jewish immigrants. I don't know who had the quota, whether it was a Jewish quota because they didn't, they needed to give us housing and take care of us until we had jobs, or if it was a quota. There were lots of quotas on Jews from different organizations in the country at that time, too. Whether it was a quota from the country, the city itself or the state itself, I don't know. But anyway, The only places that were open to us was San Francisco or Portland, Oregon. And because Portland had mountains like Vienna, and it was smaller and more likely that my parents could get a job, we came to Portland. And I started nursery school here. My mother got the first job because she knew how to sew. She had taken a sewing class when she graduated from high school. And because she knew how to sew, she worked for Hirschwies, which became, wasn't Pendleton, it was, anyway, one of the big companies that makes manufacturing companies. And she sewed on a power machine. And then my dad was college educated, but he got a job as a janitor. And then he kind of took care of me part of the time because I was 4 years old. And when I wasn't in nursery school. And then eventually my dad started working in the service station. And then he heard about a service station that was opening on Southeast 17th and Holgate. And he managed that. And that's what he did during the war. And afterwards he became a salesman of automotive parts. And that's how he made a living. And we bought a house. We rented a house right near the service station. And I started Brooklyn School when I was 5 years old. And went to kindergarten there. And I know that by the time I was in second grade, I must have already spoken good English. I know that in first grade I was one of the better readers in the class. So I already understood English by then. I remember going home with two girls after school one night, and one of them saying that I spoke funny. I still remember that. So still had an accent in kindergarten and first grade, but was losing it by second grade. So, and then I went to Cleveland High School in the University of Oregon, got my master's at Lewis and Clark, and taught school for 33 years. So that's kind of my life story. My parents were always thankful to be in the United States and had a really good attitude. As I told you, my mother talked about it a lot, about the war a lot, and about losing her brother. My dad never talked about it. I think he kept it all inside because he lost his sister and his nephew, his niece, and his grandparent, and his parents, my grandparents, and he really didn't talk about it much. But luckily, I just decided that I wanted to write my life story, and so I did. And so otherwise, I wouldn't know all the facts because as a 4-year-old, you don't know. I don't know all the places I went. So that's kind of my story.
Thank you.